When Vladimir Putin launched his Ukraine invasion, he thought that his enemy would roll over in a matter of days. Russia was too strong for Ukraine. It had too many people, tanks, armored vehicles. Ukraine wouldn't stand a chance. Putin was wrong. And one of the reasons why Russia's invasion faltered during its initial months was due to a $33,000 Swedish-British weapon that obliterated hundreds of millions of dollars in Russian armor. This is how one powerful weapon may have destroyed up to 40% of Russia's tanks during the war, and why it's so valuable to Ukraine. That weapon is the NLAW. Standing for Next Generation Light Anti-Tank Weapon, the NLAW is exactly what it says it is, a weapon that's used to destroy tanks. And it did a lot of that during the early stages of Putin's invasion. In 2022, Putin thought that he could overpower Ukraine with his armored tanks, sending them in huge numbers towards Ukraine's major cities. That strategy failed, in large part because of the NLAW. These weapons were among the first that the UK sent to Ukraine, with the Times reporting back in March 2022 that they'd been responsible for destroying 30 to 40% of the tanks Russia had lost up until that point. That early anti-tank advantage was something that Ukraine really needed, and once the NLAW was proven to be effective, the UK doubled down on sending more of the system's missiles into Ukraine. On March 23, 2022, it announced that it was sending 6,000 more NLAWs into Ukraine to help the country stop Putin's tank rampage. Before drones and before Javelins, the NLAW was Ukraine's most effective tank killer. Why? Well, just dig into the specs to get the first answer to that question. The National Security Journal provides the basics in an April 2025 article in which it calls the NLAW the tank killer that stopped Putin's army in Ukraine. The journal says that part of the reason the NLAW is so effective is that it spent nearly a decade in development before it entered service. Between 1999 and 2008, Sweden and the UK cooperated on that development, tweaking the weapon to near perfection before it officially entered service in 2009. The NLAW was rapidly adopted by several countries almost immediately, with Finland, Switzerland, Sweden, Indonesia and Malaysia being among the early buyers, alongside the UK and Sweden. It's easy to see why. Measuring just 3 feet and 4 inches and weighing 28 pounds, an NLAW is easy enough to carry on the battlefield. This portability will be dug into more later in the video. But this relatively lightweight stature makes the system ideal for firing from confined locations such as trenches and buildings. Remember what was said about Putin's early strategy for Ukraine. Russia's leader thought his tanks could just roll right through Ukraine's cities and smaller settlements. NLAWs being fired from buildings and similar difficult to detect locations meant that these armoured units were almost guaranteed to enter ambushes wherever they went. Army recognition provides a few more details. It points out that the NLAW is a fire and forget system, which means pretty much what it says. An operator can set themselves, fire an NLAW, and then move on from their position without having to worry about staying to confirm the hit. The NLAW handles all of that thanks to its intelligent missile, which will be addressed in a moment. The system itself can be fitted with either a 115 or 150mm caliber launching tube, depending on the user's requirements, and it comes with a fold-away launching device, carrying straps, and a battery package. All aid in its portability. As for aiming, an NLAW launcher tube is fitted with an optical sight that offers 2.5 times magnification of the battlefield. The user simply points that sight at a target, waits a couple of seconds for the NLAW to calibrate its own trajectory, and then pulls the trigger. And that works for moving targets too. As long as the target stays in the NLAW sights for at least 3 seconds, the fired missile will hit what it's supposed to hit. And it's that missile that really sets the NLAW apart. On August 2nd, the Daily Mail World YouTube channel published a video that saw one of its reporters get a hands-on look at how the NLAW and its missile work. Precisely how that missile is made is a closely guarded secret, the outlet says. But there's plenty that's known about it that reveals why it's proved to be such an effective tank killer for Ukraine.
Within the missile are clever computers, which allow it to lock onto its target using predictive line of sight, or PLOS technology.
It's these computers that make the NLAW a fire-and-forget missile, along with explaining why the user only needs to keep a target in the NLAW sights for a few seconds before pulling the trigger.
When a soldier aims at a target and pulls the tracker lever, these computers begin calculating how far away the target is and how fast it is moving. After about 5 seconds, they will have finished their calculations and worked out an interception point.
The user only has one more task after that: pulling the fired trigger. Once that trigger is pulled, the NLAW missile's pair of motors gets to work. The first, which is only packed with a small amount of fuel, is responsible for getting the missile out of the launch tube. With that important job done, the second motor whirs into life and sends the missile on its way. And the first motor is smart for another reason: it contains a small amount of water.
This vaporizes when the motor goes off and helps stifle the backblast.
That stifling means a Ukrainian soldier doesn't have to worry about getting knocked back by a weapon that is often mounted on the shoulder. Plus, it makes the NLAW usable from inside a built-up structure. The second motor, though not as small as the first, isn't the most powerful in the world. NLAWs are short-range weapons, with their missiles having an effective firing range of between 65.6 and 2,624 feet. That means a Ukrainian soldier doesn't have to be up close and personal with a tank to use an NLAW, but they have to be close enough for the 2.5 times magnification of the sight to be capable of viewing the tank. The missile is also capable of penetrating armor, though how much depends on the source. Army recognition says it's between 400 and 650 millimeters, while the National Security Journal provides a more general figure of over 500 millimeters. Regardless, rolled homogeneous armor, which is a form of steel plate armor that is hot rolled and designed to absorb impacts, can't stand up to an NLAW missile. Neither can the explosive reactive armor designed to destroy incoming anti-tank weapons that's present on many modern tanks. Simply put, the NLAW hits hard from close range and is portable enough to be fired from almost anywhere. There also happens to be some of the features that set the NLAW apart from one of Ukraine's other major tank killers, the Javelin. Both are fire-and-forget systems, though the NLAW specializes in short-range encounters that make it ideal for urban settings. The Javelin has a longer effective range of up to 8,202 feet, and according to the National Security Journal, it uses an infrared guidance system to lock onto targets rather than the computers that are inside an NLAW missile. An NLAW does have another advantage over the Javelin in its OTA firing mode, which allows its missiles to target the roofs of tanks. These roofs are usually less armored than a tank's sides. The NLAW takes advantage of this fact to blow a tank into smithereens. So now it's clear what the NLAW is and how Ukraine was able to use it during the early stages of Putin's invasion, but there's also the strategic impact of the NLAW on the Ukraine war. The destruction of tanks and armoured vehicles is the obvious impact, and it's one that's already been mentioned. Remember that NLAWs decimated 30 to 40% of the tanks Ukraine destroyed during the first couple of months of the Russian invasion, and they've likely racked up dozens more since. That means the NLAW has been a major contributor to a problem that is now starting to really weigh down on Putin. Russia is running out of tanks and armoured vehicles. In June, UA Wire reported on data provided by War Spotting that revealed Russia has lost fewer tanks in May 2025 than it had in any month since Putin invaded. That's good news for Russia, right? It suggests that Ukraine's anti-tank strategies are becoming less effective. Except that's not the case. The reason that Russia is now losing fewer tanks is that it's no longer able to field anywhere near as many as it did during the early years of the war. UA Wire provides the numbers. It says that up to 80% of Russia's tank storage facilities had been depleted by 2024. That was after 2 waves of tanks had entered the battlefield. Russia's first wave of operational battle tanks that Ukraine used weapons like the NLAW to destroy, and a second wave made up of Soviet-era tanks pulled out of storage. The situation is so bad for Russia that its third wave of tanks will be nowhere near as large as the first 2 waves. Russia's tank stockpiles have also been diluted, UA Wire says. Its stockpiles of modern tanks, such as the T-90 and T-80, have been diminished. Older T-62s are almost gone, and more recent losses have included the ancient T-55, indicating that Russia is now having to pull from its dregs to field tanks in Ukraine. The situation isn't much better on the armoured vehicle front, as UNN reported on July 28. It says that the Kyiv School of Economics Institute revealed that supplies being pulled from Russia's storage facilities are dropping in weight from a high point of 242,000 tons in 2022 to just 119,000 tons in 2025. Just as with the lower number of tank losses reported by UA Wire, this tells us that Russia simply doesn't have the equipment it needs to maintain Putin's original strategy of using mechanized units to overwhelm Ukraine. Russia is also sending fewer of its tanks and armored vehicles for repairs, suggesting it's also running out of vehicles in storage that it can cannibalize to keep its damaged vehicles running. Now, it's inaccurate to say that the NLAW is responsible for all of these problems. However, the weapon struck early psychological and tangible blows against Russia's war machine that taught Ukraine how to hit Russia's vehicles. Those are lessons Ukraine has taken into its use of other weapons, including the drones that now litter the battlefield. Also, on the strategic side, it's hard to ignore some of the benefits of the NLAW that have already been mentioned. The weapon is portable, cheap, and high impact. That's according to 1945, which wrote in December 2024 that a single NLAW unit cost about $33,000. That's a pittance when compared to how much a Russian tank costs. A single T-90 is estimated to cost up to $4.5 million. Russia's older tanks likely cost less, though Russia will also have invested considerable amounts of money into restoring older tanks so they can be used in Ukraine. The point is that an NLAW offers a massive return on investment. When taking out T-90s, which NLAWs are capable of doing, Ukraine destroys an armoured unit that cost over 136 times more than the NLAW used to take it out of the war. As for portability, 1945 explained, the NLAW is light enough to strap on your soldiers and they can still carry a rifle. This allows the soldier to shoot and scoot after discarding the weapon and still have a rifle to continue the fight. Don't underestimate the importance of shooting and scooting. With other anti-tank weapons that don't feature fire and forget systems, a soldier would have to make themselves vulnerable before they fire and would struggle to get out of dodge afterward. The NLAW is designed to be disposable. If needed, a soldier can leave it on the battlefield and run away without worrying about the system's weight. Even when carrying the used NLAW, the package is small enough for them to make their escape with rifle in hand to confront any Russian troops that descend on their position. But surely an anti-tank system that's so effective would take months of training to use properly, right? Recall what was mentioned earlier about Ukraine's use of NLAWs during the early stages of the war, and it's easy to figure out that isn't the case. Another strategic advantage the system offers is that it takes practically no time to learn how to use it. 1945 claims that a soldier can learn how to operate an NLAW within 1 hour, which has a huge impact on the battlefield. All Ukraine has to do is train one member of a unit for an hour. Once that unit is deployed, or even before, that single trained member can then pass on that knowledge to everybody else in their unit, making the entire group capable of decimating tanks as long as they have an NLAW in their hands. The barrier to entry is so small that it can be stepped over. And this speed of learning is mirrored by the speed of the fire and forget capabilities already mentioned. Once a user has a tank in their sights, it takes just a few seconds to go from seeing the tank to sending an NLAW missile its way. During an intense battlefield encounter, that sheer speed makes it possible for any of Ukraine's trained soldiers to pick up an NLAW, fire, and then get back into position for another phase of an attack or defense against Russia's soldiers. Saab, which is one of the designers and manufacturers of the NLAW, asked its technical sales support manager for ground combat, Lars Örjan Hovbrandt, what this means for Ukraine soldiers as part of an NLAW fact sheet published to its website. He points out that the NLAW's speed extends to the operator's ability to select the distance at which the weapon's missile arms itself. Say you're in complex terrain where a number of vehicles have been hit and you have a burning vehicle 50 meters in front of you and the true target is 150 meters away. You just switch over the armed distance to 100 meters, he says. The missile will fly blind over the first target and then start looking for the target. And speaking of switching target modes, that leads to another strategic benefit of the NLAW. It's incredibly versatile. The Daily Mail World Report, mentioned earlier in the video, provides more details.
In direct attack mode, the NLAW will fly straight at the target and detonate on impact. This is useful against lightly protected targets like infantry or helicopters. But the NLAW has another mode called Overfly Top Attack. In this mode, the missile will fly about 3 foot above its target, using a magnetic and optical sensor in the nose to detect when it's directly overhead. The missile will then explode downwards rather than forwards, throwing out a jet of hot metal that can cut through 20 inches of steel.
The NLAW has been referred to as a tank killer several times during this video, and the second fire mode is what makes it so effective in that department. But the weapon is far more versatile than the tank killer moniker gives it credit for being. Choppers and infantry can also be taken out thanks to its other firing mode, which only enhances the strategic benefits of having NLAWs in the field. This combination of benefits made the NLAW a transformative weapon in the Ukraine war, especially during the early months. As 1945 points out, Ukraine has a mostly conscripted army, and many of its draftees had never fired a weapon before the fight against Ukraine began. The NLAW represented a weapon that those inexperienced soldiers could learn to use within an hour. Even the freshest recruit can point, aim and pull a trigger while allowing their weapon to do the rest of the work. Putin's forces have found that out the hard way many times over. Yet, despite all of this utility, the NLAW is less common on the battlefield now than it was when it first arrived in Ukraine. That has nothing to do with the weapon's technical capabilities. Nothing has changed about the NLAW. It still is capable of destroying tanks now as it was when Ukraine was using it in urban settings and tight quarters to repel Putin's initial invading forces. But therein lies the problem. After being battered by Ukraine's NLAWs and similar weapons for so long, Putin changed his tactics. In tight quarters, Daily Mail World explained the NLAW is perfect because of its speed. Similar weapons like the Javelin take too long to zero in on a target in such settings. However, Putin has switched from direct attacks on major cities to a broader offense in the Donbas region of Ukraine.
Here, the terrain is wide and open, with only small settlements surrounded mostly by fields and a few trees. This hunting ground is much more suited to weapons like the US Javelin. These days, you're more likely to see Ukrainian troops using one of those, or an FPV drone, which are now everywhere.
It's fair to say that drones, in particular, have supplanted NLAWs as Ukraine's chief tank killer. By February 2025, drones accounted for 65% of all of Russia's tank losses in the Ukraine war. However, the argument could be made that the NLAW created a blueprint of tank destruction for Ukraine's drone operators to follow. It was the NLAW that showed Ukraine how vulnerable Russian tanks are to top-down attacks, thanks to their weak roofs and turrets. Now, drones are dropping bombs or launching kamikaze strikes on the parts of tanks that NLAWs targeted. The NLAW also showed Ukraine that it was possible to take out multi-million-dollar pieces of metal machinery with weapons that cost a fraction of the price. These were key lessons Ukraine learned early in its war against Russia. And those lessons may have taken a lot longer to learn if it didn't have NLAWs. Ukraine is still using NLAWs. By July 2024, the UK Defence Journal was reporting that the UK had sent 12,000 NLAWs to Ukraine, telling that the initial batch of 6,000 was gone. But perhaps the NLAW's most enduring legacy in this war will be as the early tank killer that inspired the drone-based tank-destroying strategy Ukraine has adopted since Russia started focusing its efforts on the Donbas. The lessons Ukraine learned during the first few months of Putin's invasion have been carried through to other weapons, meaning the NLAW could be considered indirectly responsible for even more destroyed tanks than it's taken out directly. The NLAW fired so that Ukraine's drones could fly. That, more than anything else, will mean it remains a valuable weapon for as long as Ukraine is battling against Putin's forces. And while the NLAW showed how Russian tanks could be taken down easily, Russia has been struggling with Ukraine's tanks. It hit a Ukrainian tank 70 times and did absolutely zero damage. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more in-depth coverage of the weapons Ukraine uses to take the fight to Russia.